Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined once again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Good morning, Josh.
Good morning, Jim. How you doing?
I'm hanging in there.
Good.
Fine.
Yeah.
Well, you know, all things considered, and there's a lot to consider, I guess.
That's true.
But there we are. So we're going to focus today on the latest UT Texas Politics Project polling data, as regular listeners among you might expect. Before we do that, no way not to acknowledge the dominant political news of the last 24 hours as we record here on late in the morning of September 11th, Thursday. That would be the killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Kirk was shot to death yesterday by, at least at the time of this recording, an unknown assailant during a rally at Utah Valley University. Shortly before we came on today, police found a high-powered bolt-action rifle in the woods near the campus, but still no word on the identity or certainly the apprehension of the assailant. Now, you know, there's a lot to be said, and we'll say it later. I think it's hard not to think that this is going to be something of an inflection point in American politics, as Josh and I were talking about this morning, particularly given Kirk's closeness to principals in the Trump administration, including the president himself, who issued a statement last night. In what direction this spurs politics and governance in the country, of course, can only be a matter of speculation. And at this point, and I think a lot of that speculation that I've seen, frankly, you know, there's kind of two camps. One, I think, very controlled, the other very uncontrolled. And I think I'd like to join neither of those camps at this point.
Yeah.
So from our vantage point, we just want to note that, you know, our Texas polling data over the last year has continued to demonstrate the concern that voters have about political violence, and that concern is both widespread and bipartisan. Josh, you did some digging this morning before we came on into our data archive. What did you find?
Yeah, looking back, obviously you've been asking, more questions about political violence over the past 5 years or so. But looking, more recently, we found that, polling data over the last year in Texas, has shown that voters have concerns about political violence. So in February and June of last year, about 60% of Texans in each survey said that they thought political violence was either very or somewhat likely in response to the 2024 elections. This included similar-sized majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Democrats were slightly more concerned, than were Republicans or independents, but really only slightly. And then last year, as we were moving closer to the election in August and October, just under 3 out of every 4 Texas voters said that they thought political violence in response to the 2024 election was either extremely or very likely. Again, there were significant majorities, between 2/3 and 4/5 of Democrats, Republicans, and independents who expected political violence to be a serious problem. So, sadly, Texans have been expressing widespread expectations about, the potential for political violence for some time now.
Yeah, thanks for the quick work on that this morning. We were scrambling a little bit there. As I said earlier, there will, of course, be a lot more to be said about this all as we learn more of the actual facts and see the politics that emerge from the initial, to my mind, almost universal sense of shock and mourning that's emerged from Kirk's killing yesterday. And I can't help. I guess my last comment would have to be to, frankly, avoid social media for the next couple of days. And if you don't, not to generalize from the non-representative sample of people that are on the prominent social media platforms. I've made the mistake of looking a little bit and almost immediately regretted it, and regretted in a bipartisan fashion. So,
Yeah, totally.
I would just, there's a lot more to come on this, and there are lots of things that are deeply troubling about it, and I just really want to wait and learn more about what actually happened, and see what the actual response is. So, okay. You may or may not be able to tell. Our audio crew is so crack. My guess is you can't tell at all. But Josh and I are in different locations today. Josh is in our usual recording location in the audio recording studio in Mez's Hall at UT Austin, with our great technical crew in the audio studio, while I'm at home trying not to spread any more COVID around Austin, which seems already plenty saturated.
That's right.
And I, particularly don't want to spread it to my dedicated colleagues, coworkers, and friends at UT Austin. So with that mise en scene set, I have no French at all.
That was great. No, I was going to say.
No French at all. I'm just going to chalk that up to the ambition and the execution to being a little sick still. So anyway, with the scene set,
there we
let's
go.
Just say,
there, that's better.
We released the results from our most recent UT Texas Politics Project poll Tuesday, day before yesterday. The poll touched on a lot of topics, with the main, though by no means exclusive, focus being on the agenda for the special session. And I should add that, we'll have another follow-up podcast on the poll next week with our colleague and collaborator, Darren Shawn, and that podcast will focus more on sort of the national and election-related results. So let's start with the session results today, and I don't think either of us can promise we won't say at least a little about some of the maybe election-relevant stuff, but for the most part, we want to focus on, the big share of the poll that was focused on the special session agenda. Now, Josh, you've taken a stab at this week already in taping what we call our interpreting the news, or unpacking the news.
No, we
I
unpack
didn't
it.
have the brand right. Taping our unpacking the news segment for our government 310 intro class we're doing this term. And I thought you took an interesting angle on that with the class, and thanks for covering since I couldn't be there. So let's try a variation on that theme. Now, the core of the approach we took in the poll was to ask our respondents how they felt about 9 areas we adapted from the special agenda as it existed when we conducted the poll, and that was August 22nd. We had to have the poll in the field by August 22nd, so that's kind of the cutoff date for what we could talk about. So why don't you run us through that and start us on some of the results?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things, that we have to acknowledge at the beginning is that a special session agenda is a choice. And so it's not necessarily the case that this is a reflection of all of the issues that could potentially be on the table, like during the regular session where we might ask a more open-ended question. It really is what are they doing, and what do voters think about it? And so we have a more limited universe here, as Jim mentioned. So what we did was we said to the voters, as you may know, Governor Greg Abbott recently called a special session of the Texas legislature to address the following items. These are the 9 items we talked about. Please tell us how important or unimportant you think it is for the Texas legislature to address each of the following in a special session. So this gives us a sense of essentially how important the voters think it was, for the legislature to be addressing this set of issues. And what we found, looking at the 9 was, first and foremost, if you saw the blog post accompanying the poll, there was 3 that clearly rose to the top. Responding to issues related to the flooding in Central Texas in early July, 55% of voters said that was extremely important for the legislature to address. If you add the share that said it was very important, it's 82% in total. If we take that same approach, adding the extremely and very important responses together, 70% said it was extremely or very important for the legislature to attempt to further reduce property taxes, and 64%, so almost 2/3, said it was extremely or very important for the legislature to try to prohibit local governments from using public money to pay lobbyists or organizations, essentially taxpayer-funded lobbying for you all. Listen to this. Lower down on the list, we had things like the bathroom bill, requiring people to use restrooms that match their birth, gender, and government and public buildings. 52% thought that was extremely or very important, but only 36% thought it was extremely important. And I think that's one notable thing here is, overall responding to the flooding was at the top. A majority of voters said it was extremely important on its own, and then the shares drop off pretty dramatically. And so when we look at, revising the congressional district maps, which is a big driver of attention, Only 27% of Texans said that was extremely important. 18% said very, so 45.
And that's basically the cutoff point for less than half.
Less than half, that's right. Everything
In the extremely very category.
That's correct.
Right?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So that's where the cutoff is. So the bathroom bill was just above half, saying it was extremely or very. Congressional map just below, further below. Enacting abortion restrictions, 36%. Eliminating replacing the STAR test, 42%. This is extremely and very. Protecting law enforcement offers from disclosure, 39%. And then, notably at the very bottom of the list, and we'll probably come back to this, comprehensively regulating hemp-derived products without banning them. Only 14% of Texans said this was extremely important. Only 32% in total said it was extremely or very important. And we can come back to this. But, this was, the lack of importance attached was pretty widespread and bipartisan for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways that was when we there's always this process. We get the data back. You take your first cut. That was one of the first things I noticed, and it kind of persisted as one of the big interesting takeaways.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, ultimately, and I mean, I guess just to go back to it, I mean, the way that I presented this to the class for you all is I looked at sort of flooding, which, I would say pass in large part, although, I left the politics of what did and did not work there out because it's a little too much for that group. We talked about the bathroom bill and we talked about hemp. And one of the things that sort of underlined this, I mean, first and foremost, it's just important to note that, majorities of Republican voters, were generally supportive of most of the policy areas. I mean, or they thought it was important. 85% said it was, extremely or very important to reduce property taxes, 84% to respond to the floods, 82% to require people to use the bathrooms, assigned, based on the genders assigned at birth. So in 7 of the 9 policy areas that we tested, majorities of Republican voters said, yeah, it's either extremely or very important to do that. The only areas where it wasn't the case was enacting new restrictions on abortion access, and that's in part of that's an active, ongoing space where the state's made a lot of efforts to restrict access, so there's a little bit less room there. And the other one was, of course, comprehensively regulating hemp-derived products. So again, not seen as important to Republicans. So I mean, the sort of 2 takeaways, I guess, is one, I'd say the stuff that they were able to pass on the agenda for the most part, it's a mix of things. The flooding, supported by everybody, important to everybody.
Right.
If you look at something like the bathroom bill, you could say, well, this didn't seem that important to voters. Yeah, but it was near the top of the list for Republican voters. And if you go and look just at the voters who say they're the most conservative, the type of voters that we think are going to have an outsized role in the upcoming primaries, it's even higher. And I think it's upwards of 90% when you combine those, say it's extremely and very important. It's like, I think it's 75% said it was extremely important.
And the Democratic number on that was, obviously not majority, but not trivial either, right?
Well, no, and I think this is, we got some light pushback, and it's totally fine, on that result. And in particular, the fact that, there seem to be Democrats attaching some importance to the bathroom bill. But, the issue here is that if we go and look at our data on people's views about sex and gender, what we find is that a non-trivial minority, but a significant share of Democrats hold a traditional view about basically a strict definition of gender based on the sex assigned at birth. That has not changed, and so ultimately, that's a little bit of an uphill battle for Democrats, but it's also the case, again, overwhelming support among Republicans. And I didn't bring this up in the class, but this is something that we've been talking about since 2017. This is not at least 2017. So this is not a new issue. This has been something that's been percolating for a number of years. We've seen them make some efforts in different areas, and so this was not entirely out of left field. And then when we look at something like hemp, what you see is there was, first of all, no voters were saying it was significantly important. That's a big part of this. But also in another question we asked about whether or not the state's marijuana laws should be made more or less strict. And I was thinking about this because the way we asked that question, you could say, well, you attach it to the special session call. So maybe, what you're getting is the fact that people might feel, well, you should really ban it, not regulate it like the governor wants. But when we looked at that other result, what you find is that if you take first of all, the plurality position, I think, among Republicans right now, and it's almost an equal shares, is to make it less strict. But it's about equal shares, say, make it less strict or more strict. At the same time, if you combine the share who say make marijuana in Texas, of Republicans who say make marijuana laws in Texas less strict, and you combine that with the share who say leave it alone, it's about 55%. And this is to say, it's not a very clear signal. It's not a winning issue for the Republican majority to go in there and essentially say, well, let's pick which one of our voters' positions we want to support on this.
Yeah, I mean, I was really glad that we included, the broader question on marijuana. We went kind of back and forth with this. I think at different points we had a couple more questions, et cetera, et cetera. But, because we did want to try to approximate in an intelligible fashion for our respondents what was on the call. The wording on the item on the legislative agenda did include basically what the essence to our mind, and I think it was fair, of what was on the call, because that item did include regulate but not ban, essentially, not prohibit. I don't have the language right.
Yeah, no, and that's right. And I think, I made that.
But I think it's good for people to notice that. And it was there were a couple of different ways to skin that cat, and we were trying to be consistent.
Well, and I think it's also reflecting the reality here, which is, I brought this up in the class too, which is that, the governor doesn't get to make them pass anything. He doesn't get to tell them exactly what to pass, but the language that he uses on the call matters. And it dictates constraints around what kind of things they're going to be able to address or not. Now, whether or not they decide to follow that or not is obviously an open question. The Senate decided to do what it wanted. But nonetheless, it is the case that, the governor does have the authority and the power to set some guardrails. And so in this case, it makes sense to follow them. But that's also why we asked the follow-up question, to be a little bit more comprehensive here. Now, it is notable that the big miss here that's so high on the list is property taxes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been thinking about that a bit, just in terms of what's out there in the ether. Somebody I was, noting, for reasons that people will be able to figure out if they know me, that there was a Facebook account a couple of days ago of, a pretty big revolt up in Coryell County over a proposed, significant, tax increase, for a property tax increase election. That was really consistent with some of the things that you and I have been talking about, and you've been kind of all over this, in terms of, people that you might not expect, or areas that you might not expect to be doing this, are saying, well, look, if I have to have an election and, people are talking about lowering the threshold for the election, I might as well go for it.
Yeah.
Because I believe that, the tax increase, I was seeing that there was a kind of a public meeting that got pretty hot and hostile up there. Was over an increase that I think, was certainly in the double figures. I don't remember what the exact figure was. And, we're seeing similar things in Austin and other places.
Yeah, I think it's one of these really interesting things where the politics of this in the here and now, the policy in the here and now, and the politics in the future just don't line up, right? So we know from, polling that we've done repeatedly over the years that despite the fact that the legislature has made significant efforts to reduce property taxes. And I think, really, you can put the numbers to it. They have put a huge amount of money behind increasing the homestead exemption. That is an ongoing expense that the state is trying to cover. At the same time, when we ask voters about their expectations about their future property taxes, they're almost certain it's always going to go up, or that the efforts that the legislature make are not going to be very impactful, or that it's not really going to impact their tax bill or whatever. And so voters
and to be fair, and, in terms of how the legislatures approach it, and when we ask them directly how they think they're doing on taxes, they're not giving them an A+.
No, it's usually near the bottom. They're not even
really giving them a passing grade.
That's right. Yeah, no, it's usually near the bottom of the issue areas. And so one aspect of that is that certainly explains the incentive to come back and do it again. The challenge, of course, and we said this at the beginning, was, for Abbott, again, he constrained what he was saying. He's not saying go back and put more money on the homestead exemption. He said, no, I want you to essentially change the curve here, change the slope of the line in terms of what the local entities are collecting. And this is this revenue growth cap. And the thing is that, the revenue growth cap, the trigger at which point the voters have to approve it, was already moved from about, I think it was 8 or 8.5%, and they got moved back to 3.5%, which is a huge drop. And now the issue is well, let's put it back more. And without going into all the details, one of the things that I think should be obvious to everybody is there's not a lot of room between 0 and 3.5.
Right. And everybody that was following the way that this blew up and, first in the House and then became an, unresolvable, tension between the House and the Senate in the final days of the second session was very notable. Yeah. And the problem here really was within the Republican caucus. I mean, there was subsequently disagreement between the House and the Senate, but ultimately the problem was within the Republican caucus in the House.
That's right. And look, so, you can say what you want about, you can look at data and we can kind of try to tease out, who the quote unquote offenders are, in terms of local entities who are, just blowing up their tax rates over the last number of years or over the period of which it's spurred this response. But the reality is the politics of this has always been front and center, which are always, there's always been a population threshold. And for the most part, these policies that are meant to ratchet back local collection have never really been targeted at smaller communities, smaller counties mostly represented by Republicans, counties and small towns. These policies have mostly been directed at Austin, at Houston, at Dallas, to a lesser extent at Fort Worth, at the big cities and at their sort of large suburbs. And so to some extent, this is the one of the ways this went off the rails, and it's kind of always been hanging out there, was someone said, well, wait a minute, if fiscal, conservatism is good for Austin, why isn't it good for Lubbock? Why isn't it good for Coryell County? Whatever. And honestly, and this is, the nature of legislation, a million stories are told this way. Once that vote makes it to the floor, it's kind of hard for a lot of people to say no. And obviously for the Democrats, who might be kind of generally negatively predisposed to this, knowing it's going to pass, it's actually a delicious chance to say, oh, no, you guys get to do this too now. Now, the issue, of course, and I think this is the political science side of this, and I think this is the future piece of this, if they do end up doing something like this, the problem is that if you do set the rollback rate to 1%, what it means is that you have local elections over every single budget. I mean, basically, that's where this leads at a certain point, because ultimately, counties, cities, they contract with outside individuals. They are also dealing with inflation, which runs higher than 1% on a normal basis. And so ultimately, as a tool to sort of, slap the cities or slap the counties, eventually voters are just going to be voting to approve whatever the budget is. And the other thing is, this is what you're starting to see, and it's really interesting if you're paying attention to this, is that if you are going to go for a rollback rate election, you may as well really go for it. And that's the thing. Like, it's not like these cities and counties and towns are like, well, we want to raise revenue by 3.65% over. No. That's not what they're asking for. And it's not what they're going to ask for, because they know that if they're going to go to the voters and ask for it, they may as well ask for more, because if they can get it based on either the election type or the types of issues they're pushing, whatever they're promising to give back, what you're doing is you're setting a new set of revenue numbers that's significantly higher that you get to work off of next time.
Right, and in practical terms, if you're going to have to go to the well, you might as well go with a big bucket.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and there's obviously, as we're seeing, there's political risk in that, and it's interesting to see, and I've been kind of back processing this as we've had several conversations about this. Watching that floor debate, there was an interesting element of, this new, more populist brand of conservatism, right? Because what we're describing is a kind of impractical form of direct democracy.
Yep.
If you're going to have, people in every town of every size have a direct election on any economic budget decision of consequence.
Well, and as people pointed out, it's probably going to cost more than you're going to save in most cases.
Well, that's
just to run those elections. I mean,
especially, and that's where if you go down to 1%, it's just like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it actually eats itself. It's so,
and I think that argument took hold in some interesting corners, near as I can tell, from the discussions that were heard. But that, that kind of, again, kind of small d Democratic versus small r Republican principle of government.
Yeah.
In terms of direct democracy versus saying, look, we elect people to make these decisions, is an interesting turn of events.
Well, and I don't know people's hearts. I don't know their motivations, but I really thought, when Abbott put this on the agenda, there was no way they were going to be able to do it. And part of it goes back to just what we're talking about, right? I mean, just look at the basics, right? They had just committed $50 billion, I think, more, to more homestead exemption increases. So there was no money to throw at it. So the only thing they could do is turn the screws on the local entities, and they'd already turned the screws on the local entities pretty aggressively. I should also point out that one of the other pieces of Texas budget, local budgets now, is they can't decrease their police budgets. So there's also an upward pressure on their budgets anyway that has been created by the legislature. So, I think a lot of this, to some extent, was, just to be fair about the politics, as Abbott says, hey, I asked them for more. I mean, look, we delivered a ton. I'm being aberrant. We delivered a ton, but, I asked them for more and, couldn't do it, next time. And he gets to say, hey, I tried. But I honestly think that that's about kind of where that landed kind of where it was likely. And the fact that it went off the rails as much as it did was in some ways a reflection of the fact that there was almost nowhere for it to go but off the rails. Yeah,
no, I think that's fair. And I'm very curious to see where this issue is going to go. And, the police budget component is an interesting political piece, given that you're pitting one overarching national theme of law and order and policing against, what is one of the most localized issues that you could see, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's also a central plank of Republican politics right now. And frankly, I think it's also fair to notice that once again, there were no small share of Democrats that result on the importance of property taxes in the legislature, right? I mean, nobody really wants to pay a bunch of property taxes, and that gets us to, wants to pay the level of property taxes that Texans are paying. And it does get to another long-standing macro issue of the sources of revenue in the state.
Yeah, and I think it does speak, one of the things we're not going to talk about during this podcast, but, sort of the continued, it led in the rollout, but the sort of continued negative economic perceptions. And the thing is that, if your home's value is staying relatively steady and your income is staying relatively steady, but the cost of everything else is going up, well, then, the impact of your housing and your property tax costs on your overall quality of life is actually getting worse, even as your property taxes maybe aren't going up as much as they were. So it just makes it as one of the major expenses that people are going to have, housing, and it folds into housing. It's just front and center for a lot of people in a way that I think, it's just, again, you can't just sort of, you can't brush it away very easily.
Well, and I think, it's a good point. That's a good connection. And I think it really points to kind of one of the major themes in the poll that we emphasize in the rollout.
Yeah.
And that has been brewing. And that is, the persistence of concerns about the economy. Mm-hmm. And in particular, the persistence of concerns about what we'll broadly call, kind of core costs of living.
Yeah, core cost of living is good.
In the sense that, the top economic concerns that we saw were, the prices of everyday goods, the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing that you flagged.
Yeah.
And, I think that's the other kind of essential element of the big overall picture of the electorate and of public opinion in the state that we saw in the poll.
Yeah, it's hard to feel like you're doing well when you're getting less, even if the number's the same.
I think that's part of, for people that are aware of property taxes, or even if they're not, when you ask them what's important, anything that kind of, resonates with those other really overarching concerns that, frankly was not, a major theme of this legislative session. And they can't do everything. And there was a lot on the table, obviously.
Right.
Before we escape this, we should, and I want to talk about how the leaders are doing, but we haven't really talked about attitudes on redistricting. And I think we should at least touch on that. Yeah. Since it was such a major theme of the session. It was one of the elements that was obviously deeply partisan. It was not surprising to see the partisan split that we saw. Something they did, but something that was, in that under 50% group, it's hard for me not to feel like there is a tension between all of these economic concerns on one hand and, the clearly central, if not instigating role that redistricting played in this.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting,
and by this, I mean the calling of the special sessions.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, we asked this, we have a news battery in the poll, and we asked people, how much they've heard about a series of state and national political stories. And, when it comes to the special session, about, I think 47% of people said they'd heard a lot about it, which is actually pretty high for a state level story, but it was still significantly lower than the share who said that they'd heard a lot about redistricting. And it's not to say that, I mean, like, and again, you're saying, well, how's that possible? And like, no, it's not confusing at all. People heard about it through national news. They heard about it through other sources. A lot of people don't know that Texas has a 140 legislative session and what a special session is and all that sort of stuff. So it's not crazy. But ultimately, the fact that they were there and the fact, it was known to people, but more known to them was that they were dealing with redistricting. I mean, that was higher on the list of what people were paying attention to. And so, a lot of people are going to come out of this, and we'll kind of come back to this maybe at the end. But, when you say like, well, what was the big thing that came out of, we're talking about all the other issues that kind of came out of the summer. It's like, well, Trump asked them to redistrict, and they did. And a lot of people heard about it, and they have thoughts. And, overall, on balance, negative, as you said, more negative among Democrats, Republicans, largely okay with it, for the most part. But, it is one of those things where, despite, I mean, what's interesting is despite the fact that, redistricting ended up driving, most of the national coverage and really, in a lot of ways, really driving a lot of the action indirectly or directly in the special session. It was only one thing. I mean, it was only one thing on this huge agenda of items.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of, the interesting piece here to some extent, it's like what's going on here and how did it affect everybody? Because obviously, as I said at the top, this is the governor's agenda. This was chosen for a reason. So, it does sort of raise the question, how did it work out for him?
Yeah. And not to wander too far into media effects, but obviously, as you kind of, got out there, this became what this was because it was a story. This became a national story because it was a national story in the sense of, as you say, the instigation of this by the White House, which, I think in the legislative debates, the sponsors, the Republican advocates for this were not eager to talk about this, but they couldn't really deny it either.
Yeah.
So you got a lot of kind of when the Democrats brought it up.
Right.
But everybody kind of knew what was going on with that, though they wanted to talk about it in different ways. But from the perspective of the people that were surveying in a public opinion poll, the volume of the coverage as not just a run-of-the-mill state legislature story that not a lot of people pay attention to versus a big national story that during this period led coverage in both conservative and progressive and, in basically all news outlets.
No, I'd have to go back and look at prior special sessions, but I'm fairly certain that when we've asked that news coverage or news attention question in prior special sessions, we did not see nearly half of Texans saying they'd heard a lot about it. And
I mean, it was it was legitimately viewed as a national story. And I guess the point I was going to make is that also, one that very easily fits into a partisan frame in terms of both elite queuing, not to set you up too baldly, but also, pre-existing partisanship.
Right.
And I think where that was evident in interesting ways in the poll is when, we asked, do you approve or disapprove of the effort in Texas, basically?
Yeah.
And then the follow-up, well, how do you feel about it in other states?
Right.
You got a lot more ambiguity as soon as you introduced this kind of other, the more partisan battle that has emerged from this.
Yeah.
Or that this is part of, I think is a fair way of putting it. Not to stomp on the Democratic line when they came back. But that this is a national partisan fight that has become, okay, well, if Republicans are going to do it in Texas, well, then we're going to do it in a way that favors Democrats in California. Well, then we're going to, do it in Ohio, and this kind of domino effect that we're seeing. That was more complicated.
Well, yeah, and I think that's, you did a good job. I think you handled writing that initial draft on the rollout post. I mean, it is an interesting thing here because Democrats are kind of in a weird spot, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, they sort of reflexively, are I would say negatively disposed towards this idea of redistricting, maybe of gerrymandering. I don't want to say like that Republicans aren't per se.
Well, no, I was going to say, because, if you look at those results, there's also a lot of ambivalence among Republicans when you ask about the national.
And that's exactly right. And I think,
echoes.
And that's the thing that's sort of tricky here is, so for and I think it's not just tricky for Democratic voters, it's tricky for the Democratic response. I mean, right now, there's sort of a general, and I'll just make a general observation that you can apply to this, which is there seems to be a lot of people on one side, both sides, using some kind of argument that goes along the lines of, well, the other side has been doing X for years, or the other side doesn't
Yes.
follow this particular set of rules, or the other side doesn't follow this norm, so therefore we're not going to either. And it's sort of taken as like a self-evident, truth that that's a good thing, or that somehow is responding to what voters want, or that might be what voters want. And I think Democrats are having a lot more of this conversation than Republicans right now. But I think what these results kind of point to is like, in most cases, these are complicated questions. If people have views on them, they're probably developed over some period of time. They're probably supported by other views about what the process normatively ought to look like. And it's not the case that, I think everybody involved is just like, well, okay, you broke this rule. Now it's my turn to break this rule. And everybody's just going to say, yeah, that's what the game we're playing now. And this is going to shake out over time. But these, results kind of scratch at that complexity, I think, that's going on here.
And it adds, more to results that we've seen in the past and that we saw in this poll related to, going to some kind of independent commission, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've always seen plurality support for, basically making redistricting a quote unquote nonpartisan affair to some extent. I mean, to the extent you can do that. The thing I think that will be interesting to see, and I think this is, the only reality we know right now is that this may or may not spur a broader national discussion about, the way that we construct our political districts. My suspicion is that it's not going to go anywhere because ultimately it requires people in power giving up the power to draw those districts. And that's just not something that, really anybody wants to do in most cases. And in Texas in particular, we don't have any citizen-led way to generate any sort of mechanism like that. And in a lot of states, you don't. And so if that's the case, this is kind of where we're at right now, but we'll see. I'm skeptical that it's going to matter. I'm not saying in the political sense, but like in the sense of people's views about the process and everything else. Just because I feel like when people think that these rules are really going to rile people up, I very rarely think that ends up being true.
Yeah, I mean, I might even take a slightly more dour or cynical view of that, which is that I don't see in the current configuration of our national politics and the current, I'll just stick with that for now. It's kind of the worst of both worlds. And that I think the dynamic you're talking about is in play.
Yeah.
And I guess what makes me even more cynical is that it is going to be or makes me characterize this view as cynical is that it is going to be in play, even though it's institutionally a very bad and untenable place to be.
Yeah, I think that's right.
In the sense that if the new norm is going to be, if we have control of the legislature and we think we can tweak the maps in our favor, we're just going to do it. It's just, it's hard for me to understand that as being anything other than dysfunctional and degrading.
Well, I go even further. Dysfunctional and degrading, and I mean, this is a topic I'd like to discuss on another podcast. But then layer that in, if somehow the way that power develops in the state is that now the state party gets to decide which members get to run in the primary elections based on a selective decision, a selective canvassing of votes that they took in the legislature. All of a sudden now you've got an unelected party organization determining which members of the party need to vote which way on which key pieces of bills while they're changing the electoral maps. I mean, there's a lot of problems kind of floating around out there that this all kind of gets to in a really direct way. And I mean, and I don't think you need to be a conspiracy theorist or anything else. There's a lot of stuff going on out there.
No, look, to my mind, conspiracy theory is a simplification in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's an attractive oversimplification of deep structural dysfunction.
Yeah. Well,
as a proposition.
Okay. Very good.
But so, this does bring us then to, you've already channeled Governor Abbott verbally. To where we are with, what we also found in the leadership amidst all of this and public views of the leadership. And, for state leaders, this, was another poll I won't say another, but this was a poll suggesting, some erosion of satisfaction with the leadership in the state amidst all of this conflict, both, I think it's not just put it this way. I think this is partially attributed to polarization, partially attributable to, underlying intra-party conflict.
Yeah.
And also just, what a rough and ugly institutional summer it's been during these special sessions.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, just to put
talk to us a little about what we're talking about.
Yeah, let me put the numbers.
Before I offer multiple explanations, I guess we should look at the numbers.
No, this is fun. I like this. It's like a bingo game. Okay. If we look at, the governor and we look at his job approval ratings, what we saw was, 40% of Texans approved of the job he's doing as governor. That is an all-time low in his approval ratings. Going back to October of 2014, I counted, that's 47 surveys in all. So that's, it's a rich time series. The 50% of Texans disapproving of his job performance matches an all-time high in the time series, which was in August 2021, notably around some special sessions again. And I think that's part of, I think one of the pieces to this here. If we look under the hood a little bit, Republicans still obviously overwhelmingly support the governor. 76% approve of the job he's doing, 14% disapprove. High, though not as high as he has been with this group, speaking of intra-party issues. Among Democrats, 89% disapprove, only 7% approve. And that may not sound surprising, but honestly, there were periods in Abbott's tenure where he could see approval from 15, 20% of Democrats in a given poll. So that's pretty low. Among independents, 19% approve, 55% disapprove. So, I mean, I think, and I think if you take a look at the trend chart on our website, you'll really see kind of how stark this is. Because honestly, for the most of Abbott's tenure, his approval has outstripped his disapproval most of the time. He's very rarely been underwater in the poll. And again, it's 47 surveys, so it's not, a drop in the bucket. This is both, again, a disapproval high and approval low, and, now the widest gap in net approval that we've seen in his polling. And it's hard not to think that the special session and his sort of role kind of at the center of it had some factor to play. I mean, I think we've spent a lot of time talking about the nationalization, both of the legislature and of the sort of Texas political scene during the summer. Abbott, ultimately embraced it in a way that I think, our polling indicates is not problematic to him with his voters. I mean, we asked a question about Donald Trump's influence on a number of actors, the U.S. Republicans in Congress, Greg Abbott, Dan Patrick, John Cornyn, kind of just sort of seeing. And I believe, 2/3 of Republicans said that, Donald Trump has about the right amount of influence on Greg Abbott. And so to the extent that, if anybody feels like, well, maybe there'll be some pushback because, Trump is seeming to tell Texas what to do, not indicating in these polling results, but it is the case that, what ultimately turned out to be, outside of the flood relief, for the most part, a hyper-partisan political agenda, when there really was nothing else to focus on. And that's the thing we got to remember about special sessions, and we got to think about the summer, too. The political stories tend to be less. As you pointed out already, the redistricting drew more attention into the Texas special session than we would normally see. And then the question becomes, if you dig, scratch just a little bit below the surface, say, well, what else are they up to? It's like, oh yeah, abortion pills, bathroom bill, right. And all this kind of other stuff that's like, and I'm not saying that they didn't also deal with some stuff that people want, but they also didn't reduce property taxes. So it's sort of like, you are asking people to look in and see what the legislature is up to. And ultimately, this was not a representation of what, the electorate is concerned about, because the electorate is concerned about prices. They're concerned about the economy. This was a reflection of what, some Republican primary audiences really care about. And, I think it was received by the electorate, and the governor was received by the electorate in the space, about how you would expect at this point, right?
Yeah, well, and I think, the interesting comparison, looking at that trend data for the governor's job approval ratings is that the last time he was underwater to this extent, in other words, the competitor for this, all-time low is during the summer of 2021,
right,
as the COVID response was being nationalized along partisan lines.
Right.
And, interestingly, in terms of what we see going forward and what I think we're seeing already to some degree, the governor responded to that policy-wise in terms of his overall position vis-a-vis the pandemic pretty quickly and pretty decisively after that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's
and I think we probably don't have to go into there, but we saw, very similar trend with Lieutenant Governor Patrick, right?
Yeah, 30% approved of the job that he's doing, which is the same as in June. Now, again, I think, one of the things we said in the wrap, I'll say, the Lieutenant Governor, after really I don't know, like pushing himself out front, especially on the THC issue, really, I don't want to say withdrew, because that's too, I mean, he definitely did not withdraw. But in terms of, the public attention really moved to the House because of the quorum breaking Democrats, and to the governor because the governor was, essentially everyone was looking to the governor to say, okay, well, when are you going to call? What's going to be on the call? What's next? And Patrick really, sort of, I said, receded to the background a little bit. So his approval numbers stayed the same. The share disapproving increased slightly from 42% to 44%. However, again, the net approval was negative 14. So the approval minus the disapproval. And that was an all-time low in the time series for the lieutenant governor going back to October of 2015. And the next lowest approval rating was in June. So actually, this has been someone, again, I would suggest look at the time series on the website. We'll put it up in the blog post, I assume.
Yep.
But, you'll see that he's been trending negative, over the summer. And I will say in his case, I mean, this is speculation, but I think, the marijuana is really the most obvious driver of this in a lot of ways. That's an unpopular position he's taken. He knows it's an unpopular position. It splits his voters. And honestly, for a lot of people who might not be paying too much attention, this might have drawn them in a way that, I think orients them to the lieutenant governor in a negative fashion.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would say that there was probably to some degree both a strategic and also a practical lowering of his profile after the spike in attention to him in the final days of the regular session over the THC bill.
Right.
And so,
and then, lastly, we have, not lastly, but, additionally, we can look at the Speaker of the House. Thirdly, yes, equally, but thirdly, 18% said they approve of the job that Speaker Burrows is doing, 34% disapproved. This is, barely changed, I would say, from his June numbers. And, just typical of the Speaker of the House, more than half of Texas voters either were neutral or had no opinion. I think, more, which I think the Speaker would be fine with, overall, right? I'll just say, among Republicans, he was actually, is that right? He's underwater? No, he's over. I'm sorry. He's 30.
No, he's okay.
Sorry. I was looking at the wrong numbers. Yeah, 33 approve, 14 disapprove. Which is, I think, honestly, if we've been looking at this stuff for a long time with speakers, that seems about right. It's about where they usually are. More notably, when we look at the legislature overall, 49% of Texans said they disapproved of the job the legislature is doing. Only 29% approved. So that's a net minus 20. That is tied with the August 2021 results at minus 20, which again, if you were listening really closely, you'll notice that was also Abbott's approval low and his net approval low. The legislature's overall, net disapproval didn't change, or net approval didn't change much. Again, it was negative 20 in August, it was negative 19 in June. But it is really notable here that these numbers are very low. I mean, if we go back over the time series, which goes back, we've been asking about legislative approval since, at least 2011 in this poll. The share disapproving is at an all-time high. The share approving is not at an all-time low, but pretty near.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the approval among Republicans of the legislature at 54-22, I think is about the best they can hope for.
Yeah. And then you'd say to yourself, and yet, having complete control of the agenda, majorities in both chambers, you're still at 54-22.
Yeah. Well, and I think, so this gives an opportunity to kind of wrap this up a little bit. So, how did you present what is a lot? What did you see here in terms of how you kind of give us the non-student version of how you made sense of this when you did the unpacking the news? I bet you had an interesting take on it.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing, to remember here is that, the election is a long, long time from now.
Well, the general election.
Yeah, well, that's exactly. But I think, we'll this is how to deal with the students.
Which we have to remember, for most people is the election.
Yeah, that's the only election. And so, we did not, we'll talk about this next week. We did not do trial ballots in the poll. I'll probably do a tirade next week about why we didn't do trial ballots in the poll. But part of it is when we ask the news question, fewer than 1 in 5 Texans say that they've heard a lot about the U.S. Senate race. It's at or near the bottom of the list of news stories that they're paying attention to. So we just know that that's again, if you listen to this, you're following, who's getting in, Tallarico got in this week and all this stuff, and it's great, and we've got some numbers. However, the election is so far away. And the reason I just say that is because I think when, these big issues happen, whether it's, it's like, oh my God, we had a mid-decade redistricting. Oh my God, they finally passed a bathroom bill, or this, or they didn't pass tax relief. What's going to happen? Well, my thing would be to say, Probably nothing, because there's like a long, long time before the general election and a long, long time still before before voters are even paying attention. However, I do think the other thing I pointed out is that, this is a pretty good explanation. I mean, when you look at the agenda, you look at a very political agenda, you look at the governor using his powers very, very effectively to his benefit. I think, you can't walk away from, even though his numbers might be down overall, you can't walk away from this saying that Abbott's not further insulated from whatever kind of challenge he might have faced, as nominal as it probably would be, in a Republican primary.
Right.
And so, thinking about it that way, and part of what I explained to the kids is that, you look at something like flood relief, you had overwhelming support, there was no division, this was easy, they just had to respond, because if they didn't, it would create a less friendly election environment, regardless of what's going on in 2026, if they just didn't respond in some way, or they couldn't point to something they did to respond to the flooding.
And again, not to imply that the politics were the only reason. Obviously, people had legitimate concerns about this, but the politics make it easier to do.
Well, no, and I say, you can be totally cynical and have that response. You can also just say, hey, that's just responsiveness. The entire electorate said this was important, and so they did it, and that's what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, you're supposed to vote them out. That's how that works. So it's fine. The bathroom bill, the abortion pills, those are things that are, big deals for Republican primary voters, and honestly, kind of contrary to the thrust of overall public opinion in the state. But the next election, as you point out, is the primary election. And as I think I've said many times on this podcast, if not elsewhere, it's not enough for a Republican legislator to go to Austin and come back and say, hey, I didn't expand abortion access. Hey, I didn't put any restrictions on guns. They need to do something. And so they did. They moved the ball forward on those issues because that's something Republican primary voters care about.
Right. Well, and it's also not enough to say, the floods were horrific and tragic, and we all were worried about it, and we did that, and we acted on that. Mm-hmm. That's not enough either at the primary level. Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's not 100%. That's right. That's not an issue at the primary level. No one's going to say, well, I don't think you gave enough money to Kerr County, and that, it's like, no, that's not.
Unless they didn't do anything.
Right.
And then it would just be piled on top of the other stuff.
Exactly. Right? And so I think, that all makes a fair amount of sense. We already talked about, the marijuana thing just being kind of a loser because there is no clear public sentiment here that explains it. And so I think, you can kind of look across it all and sort of say, it all hangs together, even if it feels kind of random in some sense.
Well, I think from our, from the perspective of what we're talking about this week, topic wise, and I felt like we had to kind of inject it a little. The economy is the thing that straddles the two.
Yes.
The two subjects being, a focus on what's going on in the session, and our likely focus next week, which is the sentiment about national things going on and elections coming up, to the extent that people are thinking about that. But particularly the general, national mood is, we record this, this is not, the news today is not going to help.
Right.
And that, we've got another week of mixed signals from the economic numbers, with, employment, seeming to sag and pointing towards making it easier to increase or to reduce interest rates when the Fed meets. But on the other hand, just this morning, new inflation numbers that show that, inflation at the consumer level still seems not entirely tamed.
Right. Yeah. No,
and that's a problem.
Well, and that's the thing. I think, you kind of go across all this and you say, at the end of the day, the economy is the economy and it affects everybody. And, you can, I think what's really interesting to me, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit more next week, but, I think when people have been looking at the analysis of the redrawn congressional districts in Texas, one of the things they pointed out is that the districts redrawn in South Texas, may or may not net those Republican seats, depending on what happens with Hispanics. And I'll say in this poll, the view of Trump among Hispanics got a lot worse than it had been at the beginning of this year. It's certainly been moving in that direction. And a lot of that's going to be based on economic performance numbers.
Yeah. And that decline has been fairly consistent since the election.
Right. And so, I think that's kind of hanging out there. And at a broader level, there are people who say, if you really look at, if everybody went and gerrymandered, or if, some subset, is it going to change the outcome of the election? And the answer from most sophisticated analyses is maybe. Maybe
Yeah.
with a question mark. And part of that goes back to this. And the reason it's a maybe is, well, it kind of depends, because honestly, if people feel like the economy is really bad, if they blame the incumbent party, it's going to probably, it's going to overwhelm some of these efforts.
Right. And I think we just, you take the institutional politics of the national level with the Trump administration, which are, fairly unprecedented right now. I think it's not to get us too into next week. I think it's just, if you're a professional campaign person, you have to do what you can to anticipate things as best you can. But there's no real way at this point to have a very clear idea of what the general election environment is going to be, given just how much dynamism and flux, how much dynamism there is in the environment right now, and how many relatively unprecedented, or at least not conditions that don't have a recent precedent, how that's all going to play out.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think it's madness that anybody that's, saying I know is just taking a guess right now, and then we'll have the usual dynamic with the people that get lucky parade around saying they knew it all along, and everyone else is trying to
everyone else is going to say, well, I
rationalize.
I never could have known that this would have happened. It's like, exactly.
And then that brings us around to, where we started today, which, the killing that took place yesterday is yet another factor in that. Who knows? I have no way of knowing how that's going to play out, but it adds yet another jolt of very sad uncertainty into a very uncertain environment. So, I think we've set ourselves up to talk with Darren next week.
Yeah.
Josh, thanks for being in the studio and doing some digging for this and all the coverage this week as I'm, holed up trying to get better. Much appreciated.
Oh, well, I hope you get better soon. I don't want to do.
I'm sure you do.
No,
I take that at face value. I appreciate it. And thanks again to Will and all the guys in the studio guys and gals, to be fair, at UT Austin for helping us manage this podcast this time and at all times. Thanks to you for listening. All the data that we've talked about, and much more from the latest poll and all the trend data, I think is becoming increasingly relevant, can be found at texaspolitics.utexas.edu, both in the post with this podcast, if you're listening on another platform, but throughout the website. We have a great search tool, very easy to find in our newly redesigned website. So thanks to all of you for listening. And we will be back next week with our colleague Darren Shaw for another Second Reading podcast. Take care, y'all. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.